To go, do you think?
Yeah. Just 1 second.
I will control it with this one
Use the
here.
microphone. Yeah. You want to start right now? Should I introduce you?
I think that's probably the best. And I tell you, you, of all the people I know, that you should like it means a great deal to me.
Okay, we can start. Mi è stato chiesto mi è stato suggerito di parlare in italiano. Cosa che farò. Una breve introduzione, perché è molto difficile per me parlare o spiegare qualcosa sia dell'autore che di questo libro. Non so come si fa a lavorare. Allora, definire o spiegare per chi non lo conosce, Jonathan è un'impresa estremamente complicata. Noi ci conosciamo da una vita. L'altro giorno facevo 2 conti e ho scoperto che la prima volta che ci siamo incontrati, you may not remember the date, we met in 1978, first time, at the conference in Brno.
That's right. Yeah, I thought it was earlier than that. But...
Dove tutti e due eravamo co-chair, non senza conoscere uno dell'altro, co-chair di una sessione di questo congresso, ed era una sessione sui films, maiali, sui film. E lui portava una presentazione su Giant Forest Rock di Locher, è stupendo. E quindi io lo conosco da una vita. E non so bene da che parte cominciare per spiegare ieri. Posso cominciare dall'ultimo suo achievement, diciamo così, che è cittadino italiano. E lui è molto orgoglioso di essere cittadino italiano, finalmente.
L'età europea invece che inglese.
Ecco. Di fatto non è, vive un po' a Roma, un po' a Oxford, però c'è una storia dietro che nasce dal Tanganica adesso Tanzania, per girare poi tantissimi altri posti. Jonathan è uno scienziato, innanzitutto. Ha scritto moltissimi paper e libri con dati, fatti, come si conviene uno scienziato. È un divulgatore formidabile, ha scritto un sacco di libri che sono di divulgazione e quello che vedrete stasera è parzialmente anche di divulgazione, ed è un artista. Io poi ho una totale come dire, venerazione per come e per quello che produce, disegni, quadri, statue, oggetti, con un'invenzione incredibile. Molti di questi sono, li vedrete perché lui farà vedere cose estratte dal libro dove ci sono molti di questi suoi disegni, di queste sue opere, sono veramente, secondo me, notevoli. Dovrei dire anche qualcosa sul libro, ma anche il libro è di difficile classificazione, perché questo libro è un insieme di libri messi insieme. Innanzitutto è il racconto di una storia di esplorazione verso le origini dell'Africa, della fauna, dell'ecologia dell'Africa, con tutte le implicazioni scientifiche, tecniche, ma anche politiche, antropologiche, etnologiche e così via. Quindi è un libro che io direi un misto di vari libri. È un testo scientifico sicuramente perché produce un sacco di dati, di numeri, di fatti, quindi sono sostanziati in maniera scientifica. Però è anche un libro molto etico, perché richiama costantemente alla responsabilità della conservazione di quello che l'Africa è stata, di quello che è. È un libro etico anche nella responsabilità della conoscenza della storia che c'è dietro dell'evoluzione dell'uomo. È un libro politico, accidenti se è politico, perché chiama all'azione, traccia un percorso di conservazione, di battaglia, chiama quasi allerta l'opinione pubblica per salvare o mantenere l'Africa in condizioni pristine. È un libro artistico, basta che lo sfogliate, dove aprite qualsiasi pagina c'è un disegno, una pittura, una di queste cose pazzesche che fa lui con 3.000 disegnetti con lo stesso animale che si muove, si comporta in maniera diversa, per cui se li guardate così è come guardare quei giochi quando erano piccoli, tutti gli animaletti che si muovono per conto loro. È un libro poetico, secondo me, anche, che è un racconto poetico di tutta questa vita passata, nata in Africa, vissuta in Africa, e percorsa in Africa e ancora con gli occhi molto all'Africa. È un libro che ha una mission, come si dice in inglese, una missione molto precisa, che è quella di segnalare il dovere che abbiamo, appunto, di conoscenza e di conservazione dell'Africa in quanto tale. Sembra una cosa gigantesca, però in realtà no. E lui lo spiega molto bene. Lo spiega bene, ma il libro non è facile da leggere, perché è talmente pieno di cose. Quello che gli diceva a lui, il primo aggettivo che mi è venuto in mente quando l'ho letto è un libro denso, sapete quando siamo densi? Cioè tu arrivi alla fine della pagina e fai, beh, forse lo rileggo un'altra volta. È come i suoi disegni, le sue cose artistiche, se tu lo guardi, non è che lo guardi così, poi lo metti via. Lo riguardi 100 volte, ogni volta che lo guardi scopri delle cose diverse. Lo stesso le pagine del libro. Quindi è un libro denso, è da leggere con calma. Io mi sono prefissato di leggere mezzo capitolo al giorno, non di più. Trentino, non mi ricordo quanti capitoli ci vuole. Quindi, insomma, è un libro da meditare, da assorbire. Però, come lui so che fa molto piacere pensare così, io sono d'accordo, è un libro per tutti, non è un libro per iniziati. Cioè lo può leggere chiunque, anche uno che non è un etologo, un ecologo, un antropologo, un artista, quello che è, lo legge, capisce e possibilmente ne resta colpito e fa sua questa mission di conservazione. Quindi adesso passo la parola a Jonathan che vi racconta meglio il libro.
It's dangerous. Just some things on the table, which should have been put forward. Just a few examples of what the media very country talking about, and the few things that you can do. So that's taking care of that. Now, what I wanted to first of all introduce myself as, many decades ago, I joined the Royal Geographic Society in Britain. And this is, they sent explorers out to Africa, to Australia, to South America, and they have accumulated a library rather like this. And it is extraordinary how it has become a kind of social, it has huge social standing. Royalty are always coming to the Royal Geographic Society. Well, I'm in a state of war, slightly, just a very, very polite war with the Geographic Society in London. Perhaps I might even create a few subversives here, because I am a biogeographer, and there has not been any room for biogeography in the Royal Geographic Society. So I hope that, you know, perhaps giving a talk here will actually alert people to how tremendously important biogeography is. Biogeography is something that people are a little bit scared of, I think, because it is the geography of the entire deposits, if you like, of life on this planet. Everything begins somewhere at some time. And biogeography is beginning to really flower in a way that it never did before, because we are suddenly having the tools to look deep into deep time. And that's why I called the book Safaris in Deep Time, deep, deep time. And so a lot of the book is about that. And so I'm here really to persuade you that it's worth looking at if you're interested in Africa. And Luigi, my dear friend here, is full of praises which I don't deserve, but he is very kind. Now, since I'm about to try and sell the book, here it is in physicality. Safari in deep time. So it's actually very lavishly illustrated. Luckily, the publishers were prepared to publish it all in color, so it has more than 400 illustrations in color by me, and one or two by my mother, and one or two by my daughter. So it's not all my work. And I've tried to make it a personal way of looking at the biogeography of Africa. And that's where human evolution is so important, because we did unquestionably evolve in Africa. And Africa is our ultimate homeland for all of us. Everyone who has gone to every corner of the world originated in Africa. Everyone in this room is an African diaspora, if you like. Not in any modern sense, because obviously there are very big physical differences, which I also address in this book. And so it's really with that kind of plea for you to allow me to be a biogeographer. It is a book of biogeography, I think probably more than anything else, but it's also an attempt because it was written while I was stranded during COVID in Mexico. And Mexico has no libraries on Africa. I had a few of my own books. So to some extent, it is also a summary. Some of the chapters are summaries of previous books that I have written and published. So I think now let me get on with a kind of, we'll look at page by page and perhaps chapter by chapter about what I've been trying to do in this book. So, falling over all sorts of tables. Yeah, and it's a great honor to be here. What does this machine do?
The voice for the
Oh, for me, okay. All right.
now
Right. Well, one of the interesting peculiarities of this book is that the American publishers, which is Princeton University Press, didn't like it to be called Safaris in Deep Time. Somehow or other they called it, and there are hundreds and hundreds of books which are called A Natural History. Some of them quite comical, but anyway, that is what the Americans chose to call it, a natural history or a natural history. And anyway, I call it a safari in deep time. So, Origin Africa is really about the land where humanity originated. You can't, in a way, stress that enough. It's an old but fertile continent that boasts the most diverse array of living things on planet Earth. The second largest continent, but host to the richest array of animals, especially mammals, the group to which we belong. Most of the ancestors of today's mammals, including our own, have made forays both into and out of Africa. Indeed, our ancestral lineage, primates, first arrived as little tiny tiddly immigrants from Eurasia. But that was more than 50 million years ago, probably quite a lot more than 50 million. If we are to try to plumb such ancestral depths, we must be prepared to safari far and wide across Africa. But where to begin? Origin Africa consists of 22 chapters, and each one is self-contained, but there is a continuity running through it. I start with the assertion that all of us are novices. All of us are novices. None of us is an expert, least of all me. Both in science is a very recently invented thing, and in our evolutionary arrival as a new species on Earth. We are a lot less than 1 million years old. That's quite a lot of generations, but still, it's not a very great period of time. Furthermore, we are novice Neolithic vandals usurping a planet crowded with elders, ecological elders and evolutionary elders that demand our respect. And I sort of introduced the whole thing with our cousins, gorillas. And if you actually get to know wild gorillas in their own habitat, you cannot even begin to anticipate the feelings, the emotions, and the challenge that presents to the intellect. So if you have any chance to go and view gorillas, wild gorillas in their habitat, I press you, do go. It's a great life-changing experience. In the preface, I write, the pages that follow are informed by a new exploratory language, loaded with messages from our ancestors. We are still learning how to translate these messages, most of them, like us, originating in Africa. The molecules of genes, themselves coded messages, offer us new grammars, a new syntax that is embedded in all living things. These languages and their messages are new. I can't stress enough how new everything is. Most of the knowledge that's really, really important is new. And I will be pursuing this all the way through this discussion. Yet the lessons we've got to learn require a complete reframing of knowledge. This is quoting from my preface. Knowingly or not, we have entered an age of learning in which everyone's lifelong commitment to ever-expanding knowledge has become, I think, the defining quest of our time. For anyone who publishes the artifact that we call a book, there are mundane, practical questions to answer. Start with the publisher's sales team. They are slightly intimidating and usually a bit stroppy. And they ask, what is the niche market for this book? Is this sort of your face value, all this here? What's this book trying to say, and who's it addressed to? So, flicking over 500 illustrations, they ask if it's an art book, a sketch book, a coffee table book, or an exhibition catalogue. And in each case, I say, well, sort of, yeah. Anyway, they go on to ask, is it a biogeographic textbook? Is it a safari book? Well, sort of, yeah. I answer that in Swahili, we call any trip or journey a safari. So yes, it has been many journeys, including some for me that go deep into deep time. Furthermore, I've been a researcher and a teacher for most of my life. And so all of the things we've just listed are in the book, sort of. Then they ask, is it an autobiography? And I acknowledge that bits of autobiography have crept in, sort of. I'm the chap there holding up my paintbrush. Everybody has a paintbrush. This is just playing a joke on a period from the beginnings of colonialism when people made illustrated their books. Anyway, that's a spoof. So how do they all sort out? And this, again, is another illustration trying to take us back to the origins of people and the world. Now, central, absolutely central to understanding the history as well as the complexities of contemporary life on this planet is the essentially new knowledge that a meteor hit Earth 66 million years ago. It's been named Chicxulub. And this is the topic of chapter 3, which is entitled dawn and consequences of chance or from chance. Because in terms of dawn, that was the dawn for us and for the world as we see it today. When that comet hit, everything went to pieces. This catastrophe marked the start of the global era that we inhabit today. It's the one in which we evolved. And had the comet missed our planet, the Earth would still be dominated by dinosaurs, and we would not exist. As Chicxulub approached Earth, a lesser chunk broke off, and it's now called Nadia, and it broke away to hit West Africa's coast, shown there. As if these two bombardments were not enough, the western shores of India, then a wayward island cruising quite fast across the northwards end of the Indian Ocean, more or less creating the ocean, that it also exploded 66 million years ago into a series of gigantic outpourings of molten lava, which today are called the Deccan traps over on this side. Its effect also was very widely felt. I cannot emphasize too much the novelty of scientific knowledge and its projection into the foreseeable future. For example, the Chicxulub impact was discovered and published in 1980. Most of the people in this room were already adult. Before that, we'd never heard of Chicxulub. We never knew about it. We knew there was a KT boundary, but that was about it. And in the case of Nadia, the one that I just showed you before, the one that hit Africa, in the case of Nadia, its crater was identified in 2022. An entirely new piece of knowledge, but very significant knowledge. Well, here is a sculpture of mine, which is called the Phoenix, and in mythology, this was a bird that emerged from the ashes of fire, just as life has emerged after Chicxulub. Now, the code for DNA, the genetic copying mechanism whereby life comes from life and creator of the proteins of which we are made, was only cracked in 1953 when I was 17. I'm emphasizing how new everything is. The first indication of human origins in southeastern Africa only emerged in 1924 with the description of the fossil skull of a 3-year-old child named the Southern Mane, Australopithecus africanus. And the guy on the left is looking at us perhaps reproachfully. The one on the right is having a giggle. Mendel's genes first acquired that name in 1909 when my father was 7. During his father's lifetime, the modern science of biology came into being with the publication of a book called The Origin of Species, 1859. This was a book born in the mind of an observant, analytically minded 26-year-old naturalist who was circumnavigating the world. And like many others, I rate his book as the single most inspiring book ever. That's my opinion, and I share it with quite a lot of people. To return to the post-Chicxulub scene, it seems that there were many, mostly quite small animal survivors in those areas that were most remote from the impact sites: Southeast Asia, Australasia, Patagonia, and southernmost Africa. Among the South African survivors were many ecological elders. It's quite difficult to think of him as your elder, but try. He deserves your respect. Because this, who has the lovely name of Spookpadda, he's called a Spookpadda. And he has remained more or less as he is today, essentially unchanged for millions of years. These are the subject of chapter 13 in the book. They include spiders, scorpions, some fish, and some frogs. And this is one of my interpretation of a land of elders. Everyone there is an elder, and so is he. The only African mammals to survive extinction belong to a newly minted taxon, which was just named for the first time about 20 years ago. And it's called Afrotheres, which means mammals of Africa. And it's extraordinary that, 20 years ago, we didn't even have a taxon called Afrothere. It's a new taxon, but all the animals in it are ancient, much more ancient than we are. And among the surviving Afrotheres were the ancestors of elephants. And this is just a few quick sketches of mine I had a relationship which is described in the book with a very young elephant, but you'll have to read that to find out about it. The evolution of animals is, of course, inseparable from that of plants. I get reminded about this by my wife here, just in case I sometimes forget. So an early chapter serves as a reminder that no animal, including humans, can exist. It cannot exist in the absence of plants. Several of my earlier books or book covers have consisted of vignettes of flowers or trees framing going around their sides, silhouettes of the many mammals that I have spent quite a few decades studying. Among South Africa's marvelous fauna and flora are descendants of the escapees from the Chicxulub meteor impact. Two illustrations, these two that are shown here, illustrate moraines on the left and proteas on the right. Well, the chapter 17, quite a long one, is devoted to celebrating the wonderful botanical inheritance that we have in Africa. A chapter titled Translating Nature reflects my personal interest in the evolution of visual signals. In the case of plants, the patterning of flower petals, as we saw just before, and In the case of flowers, of course, there are signals that are driven by the eyes of pollinating insects. The insects have to be attracted. But because patterns can be said to be selected in the eyes of beholders, among them predators and competitors and mates, and who is the beholder? So chapter 4 and 6 include essays on the plumage of birds and the dazzling complexity and flamboyance of tropical fish. And this is a sort of sketch out of this sketchbook in which I just started exploring the grammar, if you like, the lexicon of fish patterns. My earlier explorations on this topic focused on the striping of zebras and other animals and on the face patterns of monkeys. That's chapters 11 and 14. This actually shows a series of modern zebras on the left, extinct quaggas in the middle, and extinct horses on the right, all derived from a careful study of rock paintings. Well, it's important to remember that Africa was entirely surrounded by sea for many millions of years, and since Chicxulub too. Anything that could fly, be blown, swim, or be rafted had some potential for reaching Africa from other continents, but larger terrestrial animals had to find a way on in other places. And here we can see they needed, when we're talking about larger mammals, firm bridges or suitable corridors. And only when northward cruising Afro-Arabia began to bump into Eurasia, and of course you have your Alps, which are the product of Africa crashing into Europe. It's a marvelous thing to see. We've just came in a few days ago flying over the Alps, and they were as clear as a diagram in a textbook. There was the shore of Lake Tethys, push, 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 boom, and there were the Alps. And it's bloody marvelous, a marvelous way to think of this thing, these amazing mountains, the product of things that are happening deep in the crust, deep under the crust of the earth, pushing these bits and pieces we call continents up against each other. And that goes right the way across the world. Our own lineage, that's primates, thought to have arrived overland from Eurasia more than 50 million years ago, came to flourish in Africa. Sometime after 10 million years, the fateful parting between apes and our own hominin ancestral lineage took place. And the agency was almost certainly biogeographic. So I think I'm going to get up and actually try to demonstrate what is really important about this. Here we have a belt which is running from east to west, right across Africa, north of the equator. And here we have a lineage going all the way from the corner of Africa right down here, and that is divided by latitude. So we have latitudinal realm, the longitudinal. And these break up into separate things, and that is how we can begin to understand how and when and where African animals, African plants, African organisms evolved. So biogeography And that's why I'm very pleased to be talking in the Geographic Society of Italy, because we're all going to have to think much more in biogeographic terms. We can understand so many things so much better if we accept the basic premises of biogeography. When it comes to the eastern strip, which is south of the equator, well, it straddles, up at the north, it straddles the equator. Our own hominin ancestors inhabited the eastern austral thing. Now, a lot of people who have studied skulls and genes and so on have not yet to realize just how important biogeography is in understanding evolution in Africa. And so the identification of discrete habitats in which we find complete communities of plants and animals. Some of them overlap and some of them don't. But it's very important to take on board this sort of way of looking at Africa. And you can see the black line running all along the coast. These are more or less permanent forests of a very particular type. And for our own Homo genus, the evidence points to emergence in the southernmost, most temperate refugium, way down south below the Limpopo River. That's the bottom one of all. But their ancestors inhabited at various times all that coastal habitat, almost certainly. Now, this is really a reminder that I wrote this book during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was aware, like all of us, never before, of how diseases and plagues are our own and all other creatures' ultimate fearsome predators, much more so than lions or crocodiles. And this became the topic for chapter 10 in the book. It is actually a panel that I painted on the ceiling of a chapel in Makerere, and I borrowed the iconography from the Book of Revelations. And so this was my 1960s take on the many-headed pandemics that have always and will continue to probe both our physiological and our pharmacological defenses. An odd departure maybe, but disease is so central to evolution that it can't be ignored. Our own hominin ancestors inhabited the austral longitudinal realm, and where are we now? Sorry. For another sort of comprehension of the workings of evolution, Darwin has given us the context in which to understand that variations in the actual behavior, ephemeral behavior, but nonetheless highly significant, of ephemeral living beings, ultimately that is what determines their sizes, their shapes, their structure, their colors, their patterns, and much else of those still behaving organisms and their survivors and their descendants. I've contracted discussion of that topic into a chapter heading "The smaller, the bigger, the faster, the slower, the louder, the quieter," followed by the assertive title, Behavior Drives Morphology. This is, again, one of these new insights that we have. We have to accept that something as ephemeral as what we say and what we do and the way we behave can determine evolution in the long run, but it is a very, very long run. I once attempted a painting that contrasted inert mineral stuff with the durability and the vitality of life. The silhouettes of these two birds, similar to known fossils from some 30 million years ago, stalk past the outline of 1 million-year-old Kilimanjaro, the greatest mountain in Africa. It's 1 million years old. The birds are 33 million years old. My title, Old Birds, Young Mountain. Throughout Origin Africa, I've tried to find words and imagery to express our dawning consciousness, our dawning awareness of a universe and nature redolent with countless remaining mysteries waiting for our descendants to explore. Even topics as fundamental as, say, human skin color have had very scant, serious attention, especially as linked to the earliest dispersions, the genetic conjugations, and the extinction of human populations. Chapter 19, entitled Out of Africa and Back Again, augments discussions that are still mired in controversy. But once again, I'm going to get up and just point something out. Here is where most of humanity evolved and flourished. And some populations at some periods managed to get right up here and right down here. And of course, the agent here, what is really interesting about this is that the agent of human dispersion in all this area was the result of technology. They couldn't have done that without having some form of craft. Might have been a canoe, it might have been a raft, it might have been, anyway, some form of a boat. But that has enormous significance because almost certainly that, particularly along the very margins of Asia, that is probably where all people with darker pigments, and many of us have bits of darker pigment hidden away. It's all very controversial. It has a long way to go, but I'm pretty confident that if people think in terms, genetic terms of actually, as we get to grips with the genetic histories of animals and plants and people, right the way through the world in time past. And of course, in this respect, the Americas are completely irrelevant because people went there so late, it doesn't count. What counts is what happened in Africa and Eurasia in terms of our own dispersion and our own thing, because the Americas were discovered yesterday. Anyway, let's move on. Chapter 19 is entitled Out of Africa and Back Again. And Origin Africa is an attempt to marshal together insights from a lifetime's experience, admittedly a very personal lifetime, but it has been experienced under this single umbrella of evolution by natural selection. It is quite simply the outcome of childish curiosity. Something I share with most fellow scientists. Origin Africa is partly about the child in all of us. Origin Africa, I dedicated it to loving mothers, to scientists, naturalists, artists, and musicians in a one day to be united Africa. And this was a painting, just to puzzle you. It was made to go round and round and round for a television program. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Luigi,
Thank you.
for introducing me. And thank you all for coming. It's very, very encouraging to see in the environment of books. Yes, books. We hope some of them will last, because we don't.
Any questions? Domande? Commenti?
I have a question. I have a sense of what you mean by biogeography, but could you just explain it in your own words, what that means to you? Because it's a theme that's running through all of this.
Well, obviously, geography, the Geographic Society in England, the Royal Geographic Society, was founded by nice gentlemen like we've seen in these bronze heads. Distinguished people who decided to go out and explore the world. But biogeography is much more, in a sense, much more ambitious, but also much more humble. It doesn't attach importance to explorers. Yeah, very important. Yes, it's very good to remember that there are people who have a sense of curiosity and people who have both curiosity and humbleness, because you don't travel very far unless you are, when it's necessary, humble. But also you've got to have a lot of drive to get places and go places and meet people who will be surprised to see you and who are astonished by you. But biogeography is a much, much bigger concern, because it is really the geography of every plant and animal, not only in its present form, but we are forced to study things in the first place when we go into a new continent and we discover a plant. What is this plant? And so we have to give it a name. And it just remains a name until we start to study it. And eventually we reach the point, particularly now that we have genetics, we can get the genetic profile of the plant or the animal in time, deep time. So in a way, I signaled that this was a biogeographic book by calling it Safaris in Deep Time. And perhaps that's why they didn't like it in America. You go back and change their mind. Because as soon as you start looking at plants and animals And that's all what bio means. I mean, plants and animals, bio, bio, bio. And they are spread around in a highly structured and very distinctive form. Australia, we know, is full of extraordinary animals called kangaroos. And Antarctica is full of birds which waddle in the most charming little way. You know, they're called penguins. And then if we go to America, of course, we have things called tinamous and armadillos. They're the original fauna and flora of Africa, of America. And once we start studying, we, like Darwin, he goes and he finds a bloody great skull this size of an armadillo. Well, the living armadillo is about that size. Once upon a time, they were the big animals of America. And the same with sloths. Sloths at the moment are terribly slowly. And then they've got this gigantic animal which would reach the ceiling here, the giant sloth. And again, Darwin was one of the first people to collect a skull of a giant sloth and ship it back and get it, you know, described and named and all the rest. So biogeography is really about not only the distribution of highly distinctive animals like kangaroos in Australia and tinamous in America and kangaroos, yes, now, and humans in Africa. As soon as you start going into that, then you start realizing what vandals we are. We haven't begun to study biogeography. We haven't even begun. And yet we are allowing big firms to gobble up all the forests of Africa and South America and Southeast Asia. It's an outrage in my book. That's biogeography. But you're getting me worked up, sorry.
Altre domande? Questioni?
Laura, you can come up with a question.
I was just saying.
Jonathan,
Mm-hmm.
there is a word that you describe in your book that refers to a concept which is central to much of what you say about the journey, the discovery, the responsibility, and all of that. I would like you to comment a little bit on, I mean, I was shocked and surprised to see that such a complicated concept could be labeled with just one name, Ubuntu.
Ubuntu, that's right. Ubuntu is essentially a concept that probably belonged to people much longer than any other concept. Ubuntu means the responsibility of anyone in a family or a group of people. And we can enlarge that group if we want to in various ways, but the core is the survival of that little family or group. So Ubuntu puts the responsibility of protection and care of the most feeble, the newborn, the elderly, the maimed, and the disabled, the people who have less of everything, are the responsibility of those who have a lot or who are, for their moment in the sun, they are responsible. They're responsible just not only for the welfare of the weakest of us, they're also responsible for standing up for the truth in some way. And modern politics are a disgusting, utterly disgusting contradiction of Ubuntu. That's why I get angry.
And where does the word come from?
Ubuntu. Well, it's a Bantu name, basically, but its origins, I think, are pre-Bantu. I think, basically, Ubuntu is the philosophy that guided decisions made by prehistoric hunter food gatherers. Because, again, if you don't stick together, you get eaten by a lion, trampled by an elephant, or chopped up by a crocodile. And above all, you have to try and explain the human condition as it was even then. So you have to invent stories too. And Ubuntu, in a sense, is one more story, but it's, I think, perhaps the earliest, the most pared down to its essentials of any kind of major sort of ideal, if you like.
Does it extend to responsibility toward the environment too, or animals?
Well, I suppose it doesn't really, because Ubuntu means basically it's about people. But on the other hand, I think we have to, in this series we're in, we cannot divorce ourselves from the environments that we've both made or that we evolved in, and increasingly we just make for the interests of one, well, often not just one nationality or one people or one individual. So because of the destruction of our environment, Ubuntu, I think, in its modern iteration, probably has to be extended into a care for the total environment that we inhabit, or else we're going to cook.
Okay. If you want to respect or to help the people one, you have to be aware that you are strong and his people. And I think that the attitude in the Western culture has been more to consider nature as a very strong part of the reality, not something weak. Now we start to say, okay, the forest is people, it can be destroyed, or again, the rain is too much, it can be destructive. But otherwise, we consider nature as a very strong part of the reality. So unless we consider some aspects of the environment as people in need of help, it's hard to adopt this concept and be nice with it.
I think the most immediate one that all of us in this room have witnessed in our sweat is climate.
Yeah, of course.
That seems to be the single most obvious one, but there are many, many others too. I think the systematic hoovering of protein out of the world's oceans by a small number of people for an even smaller number of consumers is a crime. I think the felling of the forests of Africa is a crime.
Yes, be preoccupied and aware of the urgency of intervention.
it's always urgent. It's always urgent, it seems to me. I don't think you can. I mean, there are so many things that need to be looked after, and Luigi brought up this word, Ubuntu. If we actually have Ubuntu in relation to our family, our human family, then we have responsibilities immediately. If we are ultimately creating a universe which is cooking, then we've got to do something about that, and pretty urgently too. But I mean, I'm really trying to awaken people in a way to a continent that is not given in political terms, in philosophical terms, in awareness. I've met people who just go blank when you say Africa. They cannot even begin to imagine what is Africa. Africa, they cannot even. I remember in North Carolina in America, there was an African-American girl who used to make the most delicious tarts. So I got to know her. And one day she turned to me and said, because she knew that I came from Africa, said, "What is Africa? Is it a town? Is it an island? What is Africa?" She was partly African herself. Well, we're all African. So that's the level of ignorance. My godmother never wanted to hear a word about Africa. She said, she just turned off. I wanted to hear nothing at all, and nothing. And lots of people are like that. They really are. So anyway, I feel that my main message, if you like, in this, obviously, I'm focusing on Africa, and I'm focusing on Africa's future, because that's really important to me, and I believe it should be important to everybody. And in any case, whether you like it or not, Africans are going to be the most numerous people on the face of this earth before you can say whatever you want to say. Ubuntu. So it is a plea for people to take Africa seriously, not just a little bit seriously, but very seriously. And to recognize that it really is where we evolved. And that raises lots and lots of questions which we are not in a position to answer, but our grandchildren will be, and our great-grandchildren. I have 5 grandchildren, I have 3 great-grandchildren, and 5 children. So I've got a big investment in their future. Ubuntu for them is important for me.
Good. Altre domande? Oh, pardon. Please.
Jonathan, I was wondering if there's any, or if you looked into the issue of colonialism, whether that's colonialism, and whether that has any influence also on.
Oh, it's hugely influential, yes. I mean, there was this one moment when a particular group of people, in other words, basically Europeans, had the weapons, they had the boats, those 2 things, and actually they had the diseases too. We very easily forget how important diseases were, because Europeans took diseases into other parts of the world, and other parts of the world, because they came back, sent diseases back into Europe. And of course, eventually America. But in my book, America doesn't count for very much, except as a source of interesting ideas, great people. But in terms of human evolution, America is irrelevant. We went there far too late to matter. But we've got to solve all sorts of problems, race and religion and all these things. I mean, you can't even begin to. It's for me, it's like a mile. But you know, when you walk out into a forest and you see, there are certain places where if you go and camp in that place, you will die, because in the morning you will not be alive because you've been inhaling carbon monoxide all night because it's seeping up through the soil. There are such places. And in a way, I think that we must recognize that we are beset by hundreds and hundreds of threats that are like that, gases which come out of nowhere. And so at the moment we are camping in just such a place under a sky which is making us sweat and ultimately die. So I didn't want to get into this, but you led me into it. So
It's your fault.
it's your fault, yes. Luigi.
Okay. If there are no other questions, non ci sono altre domande. Grazie.
Grazie a te. There are a couple of books for sale if somebody is desperate for them, they can, but there are only 2, so.
So anyway, if anybody wants to look.
Thank you very much.
Questo è il guy.